The last one I didn't get back.
28.
And how many would you have needed to have done?
30.
Wow, 2 more.
And a German fighter plane would come out your head on, and they'd roll upside down and go right through your formation.
Really? Well, they were gutty.
They could fly those planes. Unbelievable.
Ha.
And that's not just games that
No,
was watching.
We were bombing cities.
Yeah.
That was my third trip to Berlin. I've been to Frankfurt twice and Brunswick twice, and I don't remember all the names of places. And very often the target was the railroad yards. Well, the railroad yards in those cities were almost in the center. They weren't way out in the country. And even though the people were told that the Norton bomb site, they could drop a barrel of a bomb in a pickle barrel. Well, that's true. If you had enough pickle barrels scattered all over out there, the bomb's going to get into one of them. And the bombardiers couldn't release the bombs very often just on the lead ship, and they'd be dropping out for maybe a half a minute. So you're traveling 3 or 4 miles if those bombs are being scattered across the sea. And I asked one time, why don't we bomb the Ruhr Valley where the steel mills are? And they said, well, there's too much anti-aircraft fire. We'd have too heavy of losses, which is a bunch of crap, because if they'd have bombed the steel mills, the war had been over in 6 months. They ran out of steel.
Ha. Why were you
And we
bombing?
didn't bomb the Krupp munition works or the Ford truck plants or the Firestone tire plants.
Why were you bombing the buildings?
cities where women and children and
Well, it was a
old
target.
And regular age men too.
men. Mhm.
It was and you ever remember Siegfried Wagner?
Mhm.
You remember Sig Wagner. Well, he worked for the OSS, which was a forerunner of the CIA, and he lived in there near Beaker Park, and he was a German from Germany, and of course he listened to German broadcasts on shortwave radio, and he was one that was picking targets, the psychological targets. Did you think of, huh?
Terrorism.
Yeah,
Mhm.
sure.
Mhm.
And I had a run-in with him one day about the time the new highway went through, about 71 or 72. And I said that I talked to him about him picking those psychological targets, and I said, well, I was 23 years old. I said, if I was 45, I would have refused to fly anything but the military targets, and man, he just hit the ceiling. And it was, I think that's why I got arrested on the highway thing, was that he no doubt called the CIA or the FBI, and yeah. Well, anyway, I didn't get picked up till I bailed out, and I broke my leg up in 3 places. I hit the road.
Well, what happened to the ship?
Well, it finally probably, I never know what happened to it, because it was in a spin, spiral,
Tell them about trying to get out.
and the centrifugal force was such that it pulls the blood out of your eyes, so everything turns gray. You can't see anything except just gray. And I was trying to crawl out to Bombay, and the stringer there, that's the main wing stringer that you have to go over to get into Bombay, I was held on to it. I got my arms over it, but the centrifugal force was so great I couldn't get my legs up over that. I was just pinned on it. So I back again, off of it, and put my arm and put my knee up against that, like this. Then I reached in, sort of like chinned myself, and that leverage got my rear end over, and I went out to Bombay. And that's why the tail gunner and the ball tip gunner never got out. The centrifugal force was so great they couldn't move.
Well, seconds before.
It probably came apart from the spin. Now, whether it ever hit the ground intact, I don't know. I never saw it after I left it.
Do you know if it was an anti-aircraft fire or was it flat?
Fighters.
It was fighters.
It was fighters. I used to go back when we become back to England. I get over the English Channel. I go back and shoot those waste guns out over the English Channel.
Well, just like the guy
50
said,
caliber.
you could shoot his.
Yeah.
You could shoot his gun
There'd
if
be-
you wanted to.
The cartridges in the waist of the plane there would be ankle deep when we get back to England. They shoot thousands of rounds of that stuff.
Wow.
And every plane was doing that.
Yeah.
And so how many of these fighters would you end up, the whole group of you would you end up hitting?
I don't know. I have no idea.
Several or?
Oh, probably, yeah. But what they were doing the last year or so of the war was that the Germans would put up most of their fighters. If they had 100 fighters, they just hit one big formation and not try to be at different all over the country.
How many were in a formation?
Well, usually there was like 21. There'd be 7 and 7 and 7 in the formation, and then you'd have there'd be wings of those, like 3 different sets of those in a wing, and then there'd be wing after wing, and there'd be maybe 600, 800, 1,200 planes, bombers.
And what distance from the front to the back?
Well, the whole thing might be 4 or 5 miles.
Of 1,000
That many planes, yeah. And then they wouldn't necessarily all hit the same target. They'd be maybe 3 or 4 different targets. And it just depends
Oh, and I think of the people in those cities.
Yeah.
Oh, it just is incredible.
Did the gunners ever accidentally hit their own planes? I mean, that's
Well,
confusing.
I'm sure. You know, my navigator got a bullet through his desk, and the map he was looking at came through the side. It was in formation, so it was probably sometimes when they would I don't know what they called it on the gun. Either they were getting it ready to fire it, or they'd cease firing it, and it'd go off one shot. And I think that was one of the shots, rather than a splatter of them. I'm sure there were a lot of damage from other. We flew the colonel's plane once because ours was getting repaired, and one of the waste gunners, they had a stop on the gun so that if you were firing at a fighter and you came down across the tail assembly, it would stop firing until you cleared the tail assembly, or the ball turret gunner couldn't fire into the propellers. If he was tracking a fighter, the tendency would have been to do that, so it would stop the firing.
Wow.
But this didn't work, and he put a whole string of shells through the tail assembly of the colonel's plane. It didn't damage it to where we couldn't fly it. It was too flyable. Well,
So when you finally got out, how far did you have?
I was about 20,000 feet.
You moved up quite a ways.
It was about a half an hour.
Well, it's all about you jerking the parachute.
Well, yeah, I didn't wait. I should have waited for a minute or so, because falling another 8,000 or 10,000 feet, and I slowed down. I was probably traveling a lot faster. You'd normally fall about 120 miles an hour, a free fall. But I think we must have been going about 200 when I left the plane, just from the centrifugal force. And I didn't wait until I was cleared the plane, and I pulled the cord. Well, it felt like you had a rope tied around you. The other end's tied to a tree, and you run as hard as you can until you get to the end of that rope. But not a climbing rope, a hemp rope.
That's jerked his boots
and
off.
jerked my flying boots off. And
Which were laced up and they were high up on your
they
calf?
just zippered up. They were sheepskin lined boots. They didn't fit like a regular lace boot.
But even so, it was a jerk.
But I didn't realize that till my feet got cold, and I looked down there, I just had my stocking feet, my feet were cold. But it was, I expect that was about a half an hour drifting down.
There's flak coming around you all the
There
time.
was, well, there was fighters. There was, I don't think we were in the flak right then. We had been earlier.
You landed on frozen ground.
Frozen mud road. And anyway, I couldn't walk, and so I crawled that night. That
Well,
afternoon.
wait. Tell them about how your foot was.
Well, my foot was pointing back here like at 7 o'clock. Because it split the ankle bone off on both sides.
Wow.
And I tried to get it straight,
You just pulled
but
it
it,
around.
it didn't hurt. It never did hurt. And it wouldn't, I couldn't get it around. It just stayed back to the side. So I crawled on my hands and knees that afternoon, and then part of the night, the next day till the next afternoon, and I got picked up on a farm. Polish prisoners of war, workers on that farm. They took me into a little village to the Burgermeister, and they gave me a cup of hot tea and took me to a hospital, and the doctor said it set my leg, but they didn't put a cast on it. It was a sort of paper, wrapped with paper, and it was real swollen. And then they took me to Frankfurt to solitary confinement for about a week, and your mind wonders what's going to happen. And on the walls of this little room I was in were people to keep track of the days, and you'd have like 9 marks, and here would be 11 marks, and somebody else had 14 marks. So you start marking the days. You didn't have a calendar or a clock or a watch or anything.
Oh.
So you wonder, well, what happens then? And then I went in for interrogation, and this was probably a lieutenant, but he was in a civilian suit. And he spoke very good English, and
Put your hand
he
up.
wanted to know what bomb group I was with, and I told him with 447th. You're just supposed to give him your name, rank, and serial number. Well, I'd taken my wedding ring off because I didn't know what was going to happen to me, and I didn't want them to know I had a wife even. So I buried it in the forest where I came down. And I had my name, my tag with my name and serial number. And so I started just saying, well, I just give you my name and serial number. He said, well, you don't have to bother, he said. He went across the room, and there was a big bookcase there, and it was like a set of encyclopedias. He said, let's see, 447th Bomb Group. And he pulls this big folder out, 447th Bomb Group, and puts it on the desk. He says, what do you want to know? Flips it open. It's got everybody in the bomb group, our radio call sign, what squadron I was in, who my tail gunner was, and the whole works. He said, I probably know more about your bomb group than you do. He said, we have good people working in your mess hall. He said, we knew where your target was before they woke you up this morning. Now there's a joke I'm going to stick in there. When I finally got to a camp, and they had a building they called a theater, and a lot of the prisoners would act in a play. They put on musicals and put on plays. And this play was a skit of interrogation by the German intelligence. And this pilot was there, and they had flying uniform stuff that was imitation. And the lieutenant says, what city was you bombing? And the pilot says, what city is missing? That went over good with all of them. That's the only part of that I remember. But anyway, he offered me a cigarette, and I didn't smoke at that time, so I turned it down. And then I went back to solitary, and I don't know, I think I was there about 8 or 9 days, something like that.
Mm.
Then they shipped me to Frankfurt, or to Sagan, which is southeast of Berlin, about 90 miles. And I was in what was called the West Compound, and the North Compound was where the British were for the Great Escape, which is across the fence from us.
How did they ship you? By train? or
Train.
truck?
Train, just like just a boxcar. There were several of us in there.
Cold? Winter? Winter time?
Well, it was then it
No,
was about
April.
the middle of May.
How many of you were shot down?
Out of our 30, there was probably 21 in the air. There's probably 12 or 13, about half.
Mm.
Of the planes?
Yeah, in our group.
Wow.
So I would imagine that not more than 5% ever completed their 30 missions.
Really?
The average loss was like 4% a day.
For each trip? So
How many
25
did they
trips.
say were lost today? Interestingly, today in Washington D.C. they opened the memorial for the World War II on the 29th of April.
400,000 killed in World War II, Americans. 400,000 Americans, and 40 to 50 million people worldwide. 40 to 50 million died in World War II. 90% of those are civilians. In World War
Well, it
I,
sounds like about 2/3 were between the Jews and the Russians.
well, the Russians lost, I guess, 20 million or something like that.
So then if you add another 6 or 7 million Jews, there's 2/3 of that 40 million.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were a lot of Japanese too.
Honey?
Today I heard 50 million on the
Oh, did you?
memorial. I'd heard 40 before. World War I, the civilian casualties were 10%. And in World War II, they were 90% of the losses.
Yeah.
90%
Of the losses were civilians.
oh, they're civilians.
But in World War I, it was 90% were military. Because they go out in the fields and
Interesting.
trench warfare and shoot each other. Soldiers shot soldiers. But I didn't have a cast on, and they gave me some crutches, which were about 6 inches too short. And so the small bone in the leg here that was broken, I could feel it click. I'd run my legs like this in bed. I could feel that bone clicking like that. So I kept hounding them, and they finally sent me to a camp that was west of our west compound, a mile or so. There was another rehabilitation camp, and there were 2 French doctors there. And what that camp was forced labor. The prisoners that were forced to work in factories, like 10 hours a day, 7 days a week till their health gave out. And they'd ship them into that rehabilitation camp, so to speak, to recover. But these French doctors said that most of them died there. They had figured they'd lost 80,000 had died in that camp,
Wow.
rehabilitation camp. And these French doctors were prisoners too. Anyway, they set my leg, and the ankle bone was already starting to heal, and it was spread, so it's wider than it should be, and the little bone is not joined end to end, it's knitted side to side, but it never caused me any trouble. Well, a funny thing happened the first week. Back up a little bit. In our barracks, about 100 and what's the 124? 900. 124. That's how many was in our barracks. Because they count us every morning and
Thank goodness you're here, Bill.
every
We never
evening
know.
during appel. And there was a Navy flyer named John Dunn, who happened to be the same name as the president of Palomar College when I went up. He was in the Navy, and his name was John Dunn, but it was a different guy. And he flew a fighter off of an aircraft carrier in the North Sea. And if you got lost, you could call in for a compass heading from your home base. Well, he got lost, so he called into the aircraft carrier for a heading. Well, there was two that were confusing. One was called a QDR, which is the heading from where I am to back home, and the other is a QDM, and that's the heading from the home base to you. And you were taught not to fly either one of them, whatever it was. You flew at 90 degrees to that for 5 minutes and called in for a second one, and you could triangulate whether your aircraft carrier was there or the aircraft carrier was back there.
You could, I couldn't.
Anyway, he didn't bother to check, so he flew the QDM and flew over Germany, and they shot him down. First mission off of an aircraft carrier, he shot down over land looking for the aircraft carrier. And he was a prisoner for about 5 years.
Oh, man.
So he was a senior officer in our barracks. And every couple of weeks they'd have a barracks inspection by the German captain that was in charge of the camp and our colonel who was in charge of the west compound. And so they mop the floors and pick up cigarette butts out in the yard and just it was a good thing. Anyway, I hadn't run into this John Dunn. He lived in the end room next to ours, and I didn't have to fall out for a pail because I couldn't walk the half a mile down to the parade ground. So they checked the barracks. Anyway, we were getting ready for an inspection, and I was standing looking out the window, and just John Dunn was out there, and he was telling everybody to pick up the cigarette butts. And he yelled at me, he said, "Get out here and pick these cigarette butts up." He hadn't seen my crutches because I was just standing there, and he couldn't tell. He hadn't seen me before that. And I said, "You know, anybody that doesn't know a QDM from a QDR can pick up their own goddamn cigarette butts."
Oh.
Well, he says, "I'll report you to the colonel." I said, "Go ahead." So pretty soon they come and they said, "The colonel wants to see you." So I hobbled over there on these short crutches, and the I didn't have a cast in it, it was just a paper thing. And saluted the colonel, and he said, "Since you're not picking up cigarette butts." I said, "No, sir, I can't bend over very well." He said, "I can understand that. Just go on back." That was the end of that. He probably felt the same way I did about what I said, you know. Well, about every 2 weeks, we didn't have to fall out to be counted in the evening. The evening appeal was skipped, and that meant they'd count you in bed at night. And in our room, there were 5 sets of triple-decker bunks. There were 15 of us in our room. And we played bridge till midnight when the lights went out. And about 12:15 then, we hear the 2 guards, we called them goons, come in with their flashlights, and they'd start counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and well, they'd count to 3, and the next one they'd count 3 more, and as they were going around looking in the bunks. Well, this guy that slept above me, Bob Abrams from St. Louis, he picked German up pretty fast and good pronunciation, so he'd just add a couple or 3 more numbers in there. So they'd have 17 or 18 prisoners, and they'd write it down and go to the next room. And other barracks would do the same thing. On the first counts, you add a number. And then about 2.5 hours later, they'd have to come count again because they had too many prisoners. And this time, if you were awake and you felt like it, you just fold your mattress up and get in a locker. That meant you were at sick bay. So now they wouldn't have but 14 people in that room. They wouldn't get it straight till the next morning it fell. And we didn't have any money, so you didn't play poker, and you played bridge, and you played bridge all day until midnight when the lights went out. There'd be at least,
Not the same people, but there was a
well, there were
bridge game
15 in
going
the
on.
room, and there'd be like
Yeah.
4 or 8 playing,
Mhm.
and sometimes probably nobody was playing, but I'd say 3/4 of the time the bridge game's going on somewhere. And we were up near the front of the main gate in our section, and so it'd only be about 10 minutes after 12 till they'd come in for the appel count at night. And we'd just sit there, pitch black, shutters on the windows and no lights. It's absolutely pitch black. And we're bidding 3 clubs, 4 hearts, putting cards out there, and they show the light on these crazy Americans. They play bridge in the middle of the night, they can't even see.
Mhm. But those cards were World War One.
Most of the cards were World War I vets. They were our parents' age. And there was one of them that was I don't know what his position
Something
was.
clicked.
Oh, did,
Yours.
Anyway, his name was Fisher, and he'd been a bartender in New York City, and he spoke very good English. And he'd come around, he said, well, you guys are winning the war. He says, you can't believe that BS over the loudspeaker over there. He said, Germans are losing the war. You'll be home by Christmas. Well, we didn't get home by Christmas, but he used to tell us that. And we got these little briquettes of kind of a compressed powdered coal into a brick form. And each man got, I don't even know what the number was. So 15 of us got 30 a week or 45 a week, or I don't remember the number. And they were in a pile outside of our compound. So we'd take cardboard boxes, and Fisher would be the guy that'd take us. So from our barracks, there might be 10 guys going with boxes to get briquettes for your room. And he'd say, now you know you're only supposed to get like 45 for your room or whatever it was, and I've forgotten the number. But he says, if you give me a cigarette, he said, I'm going to go over here and smoke for a little bit, but you keep track, which meant take all you can carry. So he'd be wandering around getting cigarettes from other guys. And, so he helped us out that way. An interesting thing, though, was when there would be the Nazi party officers that would come around with the I guess we had a German colonel. I don't remember that for sure. Probably so. That was the head of the camp. They'd come through on inspection, and you could pick out the ones that were the party members. Just like when you look at an apple that's been polished in a bin of apples. Now, they didn't look more polished necessarily, that same uniform and everything, but their countenance stood out, that this wasn't a regular, one of the average guys.
I can pick out an FBI agent.
Yeah.
Hearing lots of stories. One actually really long story. Yeah.
Tell them about you told me about cooking and in the ground.
Yeah. When we
Yeah, right at the beginning of,
when we moved it, they moved us to, the last camp was down at a place called Mooseburg.
I think this is his name.
Do you know where that is, right?
Harold goes on there, getting involved.
Way south.
Nem's on the phone.
Oh,
You wanna talk with her?
sure.
Okay, I'll put it on pause.
Alright, here he is.
You told me this.
camp that we got to down in a town called Mooseburg, and there were about 80,000 prisoners there. And the story was we were going to be held as hostage for Hitler. That's why they were concentrating us down in that area. And we were in just a big fenced area that had been a dump, and there were fires in the ground. There was still smoke coming out of places in the ground, stuff burning underground. And they put up tents, and we slept on the ground with some wood shavings. Well, my buddy Glenn and I, as they marched us from Nuremberg down there for a couple of weeks, we'd stay in barns at night and walk in the daytime. And the last barn that we stayed in, we got there after dark, and Glenn disappeared. So I started calling his name, and he said, "Be quiet." He'd fallen through the floor into a potato bin, a seed potato bin for this farmer. The log little poles had separated, and he fell through. So I gave him a hand and got him out, and he said, "We'll sleep right here, so go get some straw." So we put our bed right on top of those poles that were over the seed potato bin, and we didn't tell any other prisoners that there were potatoes there because they'd eaten all of his seed potatoes. But we helped ourselves. And I had...
Now I know where they got it.
I had...
Well, he owed you those potatoes for saving the others.
Yeah. I had changed my GI overcoat. I made the pockets big, so I could probably put about 6 or 8 pounds of potatoes in each of those pockets. So when we left that barn, we were loaded with potatoes. And in barns that we'd stayed in a few nights before, I'd picked up some oats, whole grain oats, and some whole grain wheat. And so we had wheat and oats and potatoes.
You were a walking stew.
And then when we got to this last camp where we slept on the ground, and they had the fire in the dump, fire in the ground in places, the British Red Cross parcel had a tin can that had crackers in it, and it was probably about 2 inches by 3 inches rectangle and about 8 to 10 inches tall. So Glenn would take some of the oats and water and sugar and powdered milk and mix that up and put in these cans, and we'd dig a hole down in the ground where it was hot and bury that all day long. And that night we'd have kind of a cooked porridge. And all these other prisoners were running around wondering, "Where do you get that?" You know, I said, "Oh, we just cooked it in the ground over there." We didn't tell them where we got the grain or anything.
Cooking potatoes.
And potatoes, we made what's called a little jiffy burner out of the powdered milk cans. They were like about like a 1 pound coffee can. So you put fasten one on top of the other, and you cut holes in the bottom, and you put a little piece of wood in there and burn a little jiffy burner with wood. And then we had a little pan we could cook about a 1.5 quarts of potatoes boiled.
Huh.
And at that place where he fell through the floor, one night we fixed our pan of potatoes and ate it, so let's have another one. And all these other prisoners were wondering, where did these guys get these potatoes? Well, I got to back up on the story to tell
Let
you.
me tell him one thing. When I would get a letter from him maybe once every 3 months, and one of the things that he asked me for was a wool blanket. Well, I was limited on how big a package I could send to him, so I cut a blanket in half, sent him 1/2 one time that I was allowed to mail something to him, and the second half, the second time.
Well, and I gave the second half to Dawzell, who was in our group, and he had a tobacco shop in Salt Lake.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, back up as to why things were the way they were at the end. For the 8 or so months at the first camp at Saigon, and we got a loaf of bread a week, each prisoner, and it was rye bread and very hard to cut, and you couldn't have a butcher knife. But my buddy Glenn had kept a table knife sharpened on the cement, and he could slice that bread as thin as possible because you want more slices out
Last
of it.
longer.
So when we were forced to leave that camp ahead of the Russian lines in January, snow on the ground, that was bread ration day, and so this guy Abrams that used to add to the count, he was the bread officer for the barracks, and so he would take a bunch of guys over to the kitchen and get the 124 loaves of bread and bring them around, put 15 loaves on our table and various rooms, different numbers of loaves. Well, some of the fellows had already gone out to the gate to line up to leave when we were forced to leave. And here was 15 loaves of bread on the table. So Glenn and I each got 4 or 5 loaves, and 2 or 3 other guys got the loaves. We went out, found one of our roommates, and gave him the loaf of bread. Well, they marched us about 40 hours before we got to a factory that apparently was a wood pulp factory. There was no heat in there, and it was cold and damp, but at least it was inside.
And 40 hours of just marching?
Yeah,
Straight through?
yeah.
Wow.
With a broken
We were
leg.
ahead of the Russian lines, and we were with German civilians, old people and women and children and baby buggies and wheelbarrows and horse and cart. And we marched with them for part of one night. Well, along the way, and after we got to this wood pulp factory, when we'd stop for maybe 10 minutes or so for a break, when we'd have a piece of bread, Glenn would get out my loaf or his loaf and slice it and hand it out to any of the other roommates that were in proximity. Well, after we were at that factory about 3 days, we'd used up all of my loaf and all of his loaf. So we turned to our roommates that we sat at the table and ate meals with and played cards with for 8 months to slice their bread. F you, this is our bread.
Oh, dirty dogs.
Amazing.
The guys who sat at the table lived like a family for 8 months. We didn't get a single crust of bread from anyone. So I turned to Glenn and said, Glenn, I'll make a deal, loud enough so that these guys could hear. I said, we're going home together or we're not going home at all. He said, that's the deal. So,
And you did come home.
and we both got home. Anyway, a funny little thing happened. When we left that factory, they put us in a boxcar, 55 of us in what's called a 40 and 8 boxcar, 40 men or 8 horses. There were 55 of us in there. And there wasn't room for everybody to be on the floor at the same time. Somebody was always standing. Even though you put your head in somebody's belly and your legs over somebody else, there's somebody standing. And we were in there, I guess, 3 or 4 days.
Wow.
Well, along the way, a guard came, and whoever was his senior officer, major of somebody, who was in charge of our boxcar, so to speak. He said he wants some volunteers to go get some Red Cross parcel stuff. So Glenn was a gymnast, and he had huge shoulders. And he could go up to a fence post and chin himself horizontally. So you can imagine the shoulders he had, and had really small hips. So he says, we're coming. So he pushed away, and I got behind him, and we shoved our way through this bunch and got to the door and said, we'll go, we'll volunteer, we'll help. Well, we walked it was just out in the country along the railroad tracks. And here the Germans had piled up the contents of Red Cross parcels. There was no Red Cross parcel there, but the corned beef was neatly stacked, the cigarettes were neatly stacked, the chocolate bars were neatly stacked, the sugar was neatly stacked, the powdered milk, and so forth. Well, I had these two huge pockets. Well, for bartering, the chocolate bar and cigarettes was number one. So I said, fill me up. So I filled my pockets with cigarettes and chocolate bars. And then I had Glenn say, now load me up. So we gave him the corned beef and the powdered milk and the crackers and the sugar and the raisins and stuff. So I go back and give them to the major. But I didn't give him anything out of my pockets. So he hands this stuff out. And after we got going a ways, and I said to Glenn, how would you like a Camel cigarette? And he said, oh, I'd love to have one. And I said, well, here's a pack. So he opens it up, taps it out, and then he didn't hand it to me, which I was smoking by that time. He went to some of these guys, our roommates. He didn't say a word. But his looks were, if you take that cigarette, I'll bust your damn neck. Not a one of them took a cigarette. And they knew why. And then after a while...
add that you quit very soon after you got home. You quit smoking.
Yeah, I'm glad I did. I had a little pressure. Anyway, after a while I said, how about a chocolate bar, Glenn? He said, yeah, I'd like one of those. I said, I just happen to have one. And I tossed it to him. And then, when we were lighted up, then we blew smoke on it.
Oh,
so that's why when he fell in the potato bin, we didn't tell anybody else.
Yeah.
We're on our own. To hell with the rest of you. We didn't.
Tell them about how the English, when their ball would go across the fence.
Yeah, the fences were huge barbed wire fences, maybe 12 feet thick, 20 feet high, and guard towers with machine guns there. And about 20 feet or 30 feet before you got to that fence, there was a little wire about a foot and a half high off the ground on stakes. And if your softball or soccer ball went into there, you were supposed to get the attention of the guard and get permission to go across that wire and get the ball. And the Americans did. If the softball went there, they'd yell and the guard would go get it. But the British didn't. If their soccer ball went over there, they'd jump that, and the guard would yell at them and turn the machine gun at them, never shoot them, but turn his machine gun and yell at them. And the British guys would put their fingers up like a Hitler mustache. Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil! Americans didn't do that. The British did.
That's right, look who we got running the country.
Yeah.
Well, and tell them how the British could come out of their...
When we got to this last camp at Mooseburg, they took you out in this field, and you stripped off naked, your pack and everything, and you went into a building, and they deloused you. Didn't even have a shower. There was no water, but they sprayed you with DDT, so you looked like you'd been in a flour barrel. And then he went from there to another building, and there would be somebody there that had your information, had your picture and your history, so to speak. And they'd give you back your clothes and your pack, a sock at a time, and a shoe, and underwear, and overcoat, and so forth. They'd go through it, because some of us had picked up some pliers and stuff at farms along the way. We weren't supposed to have that sort of thing, so they'd take that stuff away from you. And then we went to the tents where we were asleep. That night, the British have two-way radio going. The Americans couldn't get by with a pair of pliers, and the British could get by with a two-way radio. And they were in contact with General Patton the day before we were liberated.
Really?
The radio contact. He said, "I'll be there about noon tomorrow." And sure as heck, the next morning, here the tanks are coming.
Wow.
Are you,
But there was a fight at the end there because the SS troops, the Americans didn't take SS prisoners, they shot them. And the SS wanted this town of Moosburg to fight, and the people in the town wanted to surrender and make it an open city. So the SS troops and the German Air Force guards, the guards in our towers were German Air Force, they fought among themselves, and the SS shot some of the guards out of our tower.
well,
Really?
And they sprayed the camp with machine gun fire. And we were laying on the ground and smoking and looking at the holes from the machine gun fire in the tent.
oh,
Wow.
at the end.
There only a couple of guys got hit.
I know.
Nobody was killed from
Now,
that.
you started it a while back, the one camp you went to, I can't remember, was it Saigon, where the Great Escape took place?
Yeah.
Before you got there, right?
Yeah, it was before I was.
And there was a story there, it was supposed to be escape-proof, right?
Yeah.
And so they closed it down and made you march to another camp, was that?
No, the Russian lines, the Russian army crossed the Oder
Oh,
River.
that was when that
And
happened.
the Geneva Convention rules you can't keep a prisoner closer than 50 kilometers to a fighting front.
Mm.
Now, I never heard any of the artillery, but some of the prisoners that were later leaving our camp said they heard the artillery fire. It was that close.
Oh.
Then we went to Nuremberg, and that was the worst place. The bunks were 4 high and 6 wide, 24 guys in one set of bunks.
Well, where was it that you slept on the?
And so Glenn and I slept on the bench, and Glenn slept on the table. And the bed bugs and the lice were just horrible.
Wow.
Try to get to sleep before you'd start biting you.
Oh.
And they had some air raid shelters built there. It had been an Italian prisoner camp. And then where they moved them out and moved us in, I guess. They had air raid shelters, but the timbers in them were built out of charred, they'd been burned. So Glenn and I thought, well, we just soon stay in the barracks and get blown up as to get buried in there, because if a bomb went off very close, it's going to collapse those things. Well, there was a lieutenant in charge of our barracks there, and he would say, now, on the next air raid, we're going to line up, and we're going to march out there, and everybody's going to be in line, and we're going to go into the air raid shelter. Well, the air raid siren would go off, and this lieutenant wasn't done. It was a different lieutenant, and another fellow. They were in the end room. There was 2 of them in the end room, and then in each of our sections there were 24 men, each set of bunks. Well, you'd hear the air raid siren would go off, and his wooden door would bang, and the lieutenant and his buddy was out there to go into that air raid shelter. He didn't wait to see if anybody's lined up. He was headed for that air raid shelter. And about half the guys would stay in the barracks. And we were close enough to the railroad yards there that we had to open the windows. They all hinged in. The concussion would blow the glass out of the window.
Wow.
From as close as we were to the railroad yards at Nuremberg.
Oh.
So you hinge the windows open so the concussion wouldn't blow the glass. And we'd lie there on a bench and a table and smoke a cigarette and listen to the noise. Well, at night, they bombed there, British bomb at night, and they bombed at night for about a week. Night and day for about a week at Nuremberg. And and we had no lights at night. There was no lights even in the barracks at night. It was dark. So the air raid siren would go off, and you'd hear the door bang, and about half of the barracks would go tromping out there to the air raid shelter. Well, the shelters were built zigzag, it wasn't straight in. So it zigzag, and the logs themselves were pitch black from the charcoal, and no lights. Here's this lieutenant going in there first, and here comes a charging herd behind him and pushing him up through that, banging into the walls. And then the next morning he'd line us up and just cuss us out about orderly, have to march out there in orderly fashion. But he was the first one there every time. There was the latrines there were concrete pits about, I guess 12 foot deep, about 8 foot wide and maybe 50 feet long. They had a shed roof over them, and it was just a concrete wall with a board, and you sat on that. There was no toilet seat. One night a guy fell over backwards.
Oh,
Well, I got to back up a little bit. There was a saying we had amongst us to cheer up, things could be worse. That was a common saying. So after this guy, he yelled, of course, and so a German guard came with a gun and didn't shoot him. He just put his gun down, let him get a hold of it. He was lucky it was full, because if it had been empty, he'd have hit the concrete. So he's in there swimming in this. The guard hauls him out, and he has to go to a water spigot. There's snow on the ground.
God.
A water spigot, and undress and wash off in cold water. And somebody said, "You better not tell that guy to cheer up. Things could be worse."
Tell me about the ones that ate too many donuts.
Oh, when we finally at Moosburg, when we got captured by Patton's outfit, liberated, the senior officers in each of the tent areas would draw cards to see who'd get shipped out first, and our officer drew a king of spades, so we got shipped out about the third day. And they flew us to Paris, and then there we got in trucks, and they drove us to Le Havre, where we could get on a ship when the ship would be available. And there was what we'd call, I guess, what they call the gals that worked at civilians, not Red Cross girls.
USO.
USO, but they were French.
I thought it was the,
Well, it could have been French Red Cross or something like that. Anyway, they had donuts and coffee. And you got coffee and 2 donuts. Well, everybody was underweight because we didn't have much food the last 3 months of the...
Well, what'd you weigh when you got home?
About 145.
God.
Wow.
Anyway, they said, no, you can only have 2 because one of your buddies had 5 or 6 yesterday and died.
Wow.
Wow.
So
You know, when
after
you
that,
break-
well, 2 was enough.
Breaking a fast, you
Yeah.
have to be very careful. And that was almost
what it
like
was,
breaking a
huh?
fast.
Wasn't that horrible to live through all that and then die
Right.
from it?
Yeah.
Oh, wouldn't that be terrible?
Well, I didn't go down to see Patton come in the gate because I was sick. And this is a good lesson in economics. They didn't have any money, so if you could barter with a cigarette or chocolate bar or powdered milk or corned beef or whatever it was, and there was a scale as to, like a chocolate bar was worth 5 packs of cigarettes or something like that, and a pack of cigarettes was worth so many crackers or whatever. And we'd get a British Red Cross parcel once in a while that didn't have coffee in it. It had tea bags, which was the last thing on the scale was nobody wanted tea bags.
Didn't trade out.
But you didn't throw them away.
Yeah.
In fact, that's what Glenn and I got by on at Nuremberg, was that we would drink about a gallon of, over a gallon of tea at night, the two of us.
Mm.
We could get hot water, we could heat enough fire to get hot water, and tea bags. Anyway, there were a bunch of prisoners brought in there that were Australians. They'd just been captured. They hadn't been prisoners very long. And they gave them American Red Cross parcel. And they had coffee. And Glenn said, come on. So we got a cardboard box and we go into the American tent. Anybody want to sell their tea? Yeah. Well, here, I'll give you a cigarette for a box of tea. So we loaded up these boxes of tea bags and went over in the Australian tent. Anybody want tea? Here, Yank. What do you want? Oh, here, chocolate bar, pack of cigarettes. So we're trading a box of tea bags for a chocolate bar or a package of cigarettes. So we fill these boxes with chocolate bars and cigarettes and go back to the American tent. We did it about 3 times. And bought up the tea, and went over there and bought up their coffee and chocolate bar. Well, the next to our compound there was a forced labor camp, and they were French or Polish or Czech prisoners, and they would get together there at night. And even though nobody could communicate language-wise very well, they had a little bass that they caught, fish. So Glenn bartered for the bass, and I don't know how many packs of cigarettes he threw over the fence, and they threw the fish over. So that night, he bakes this fish in a hole in the ground and fixes us a cake with some of the crackers ground up and sugar. And so I ate too much and got sick. So the next day was Patton came through the gate, and I told him, you go, Steve, I'm too sick. But that's a lesson in economics. We were the richest 2 prisoners probably in that whole camp. And not because we did something of service or because we were smart. It was an opportunity that did that. And that's the same way people like Bill Gates become billionaires. Not that they're so damn smart and they know everything and they do such a big service. There's an opportunity there. There was a market for computer stuff that the guy was able to do. And I'm not saying he was dumb, but and that's the way people become super rich, is opportunities that may not have anything to do with the opportunity. It just happens.
Yeah. It's true.
So were you in 3 different prison camps?
Mm-hmm.
Sagon,
Well,
is that the first one?
Sagan, Nuremberg, Lewisburg. Well, I got ready to graduate from college, and the registrar called me in and said, you need 3 more hours of psychology. You've had 3 hours, you need 6.
You said I had well over 6.
And I said, Mr. Carson, I said, you know I was in 3 different prison camps and during the war. He said, I know it. And I said, I learned more psychology than you teach here. He said, I believe you did. Requirement met. 3 units of credit.
Isn't that great?
That was very good.
We crossed going from Nuremberg down to Lewisburg, we walked across the Danube River on a bridge, and there were a lot of bombs. Part of the walkway was gone, and you could see underneath it, and there were bombs. They passed a lot of bombs on under that bridge. And we thought, yeah, if they had to, probably, if they had to retreat some way or other, I don't know. as far as I know, I don't know what happened to it, but we were just hoping they wouldn't set them off till we got to the other side.
Right.
It's kind of eerie to look at this
Yeah.
across there, these big 500-pounders.
Oh,
Well, the worst part that I knew about was, learned about a little later, was Dresden. They firebombed Dresden and burned up 135,000 people one night. That's 40 times more than the Trade Center. And the terrorists supposedly did our Trade Center, and us Christians did Dresden.
there's the difference.
And Dresden was known for its
Were
pottery.
you one of the bombers?
No, I was a prisoner at the time.
Oh.
But this Lee, this old lieutenant colonel that was in the Air Force Intelligence that we met,
Mm-hmm.
he flew to Dresden.
Mm-hmm.
He
So
bombed
what they
Dresden.
do, just bomb everywhere, huh?
Well, they firebombed Dresden, set the city on fire.
So it was mainly just a bomb or a few bombs. It wasn't hundreds of them.
Oh, probably 1,000 of them.
Firebombs.
Firebombs.
So it's just explosives that are...
Right, but they must have dropped them all over the place.
Well, sure. The way the British bombed at night, they didn't have bomb sites, so to speak, like we did. The lead plane would drop a chandelier flare over the city. And then in the next 10 minutes, because they didn't fly formation, you can't fly formation at night. So the bombers were all individual flights.
Wow.
But they'd fly over and drop on that chandelier flare. So they might scatter 3 or 4 miles of fire bombs.
Wow.
And I saw an Air Force movie later after the war, a German movie of the fire, and it showed people walking down the sidewalk, and the draft in the building was such it sucked them in the door into the fire.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Just like a leaf, that the wind would pick up a leaf, the draft would just suck them in. And they had so many people that were fried, so to speak, still alive, and the next day they just went along and shot them in the back of the head because there was no way to get them out of their misery. And each time over the years I've seen that the last report was about 30 or 35,000 were killed in Dresden.
Oh, it keeps going down.
Yeah, they revise the number each year, so
Sounds more civilized.
it was 135,000.
Yeah.
And outside the city of Dresden was a British petroleum oil refinery place. Didn't get bombed. And I think they did that was to keep the Russians from occupying the city and having an open city.
And think of the historical, not the humanity that was destroyed is just unthinkable. But think of the structures, ancient structures, and the artwork and the culture that was destroyed. It just is.
Dresden was known as the Venice of Northern Europe. It also
Really?
Yeah, that's right.
old palaces and cathedrals and all that. They have a cathedral there which they didn't rebuild afterwards. It's still ruins. It's a memorial to the.
Vera, tell the others about your father when he was just that little boy with his can.
So when my dad was 4, he lived in Cologne, and their house was bombed. It's on a 5-story building on this plaza. There's a little park, and they were in the bomb shelter, and came out in the house where half of it was gone. So my father doesn't remember this, but my grandma says that the next morning my dad, his tricycle survived the bomb. He was biking around, cycling around the plaza, people would come and look at the buildings that got hit, and he had a little tin can. He was taking donations. He tried to rebuild the house.
He was resourceful.
Should have been with you and Glenn.
How many criminals were there on
There were 10 of us.
How many survived your
8.
plane? 8.
Just the 200.
Did any of the others in a prison camp with you, or were they in separate ones?
McArdle was my co-pilot.
Uh-huh.
The camp I was in were practically all officers,
Okay.
and the enlisted men went to different camps. There were a few enlisted men, but that did the labor work in the camp, so to speak.
One of his crew members had been a substitute on other missions, so he finished his number of missions before the general crew did. And he was sent to Denver then when he got back as a photographer. So he'd come up and see me and took all the good pictures of Pat that I have. And he used to tell me about how Warren would he'd come over to the enlisted men's barracks, and he said, boy, he could just chew us out something strong. And as soon as he went out the door, we'd lay bets on the table just how soon he'd be back. To say, well, do you have enough money? How are things with you? After he'd ball them out, just then they'd lay bets on how soon he'd be back to ask them how they were all doing.
I had a navigator that the Air Force had cartoons of cadets, and this cartoon for the bombardier rather was the Fuddles, the bombardier. Well, I had the real Fuddles, and we were in Kearney, Nebraska, and we were doing practice bombing with small bombs, 100-pounders, and they had a little bit of dynamite in them for him to practice running the bomb site. Well, he climbed in the plane and hooked up the bomb site, and the rest of us were what's called pulling the props through. The propellers were radial engines, and after it stand a while, the oil would get down in the bottom cylinder, and if you went to start the engine, it would push the cylinder head off. So you physically, by hand, you turn the propeller backwards to get that oil out through the exhaust, so then start the engine. So we're pulling the props through, and as our Fuddles, the bombardier, he hooks his bomb sight up and drops the whole damn load right there on the concrete. They didn't go off because they weren't fused, and they landed flat. And my flight engineer, Don Sage, he was about 34, 35 years old, but the rest of us were all 21, 22. So he gets up in there and he says, Lieutenant, you get your ass out of this airplane and don't you hook that damn bomb sight up till I tell you you can. Yes, Sergeant.
Yes, Sergeant.
And after that, he never got up in that plane until he'd say, Sergeant Sage would say, okay, Lieutenant, you can get up in there. Well, tail fin on the bomb ripped his coveralls. Didn't cut his leg, but it ripped his coveralls. And he just went right on up in the front there and told Sage to get his ass out of that plane. Don't hook that bomb sight up till I tell you you can. But several times, on a mission, the lead plane was, you could see the bombs out of the other planes starting to drop, and ours weren't. You could tell by the feel. You could feel when they're coming out. I had a salvo lever by the side of my seat, and if we're not getting rid of our bombs, I just reach down and pull that and salvo the whole load out. I never told guard.
And I would just drop them.
All at once.
What was he doing?
He's trying to run his bomb sight. It drops them on the hard stand, but you get over at Target and they won't come out. So that happened 3 or 4 times, you know. I just, you ready? Well, lead plane start dropping. If he didn't start dropping, well, I'd just salvo the load, and he didn't know the difference.
He thought he'd done it, huh?
Sure, he thought he dropped them.
So did you meet Schweigerkid in prison camp?
Yeah, he was a pilot on another plane.
Who?
Glenn Swigert. I met him in prison camp.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, he wasn't in our
that's
group.
right. I was thinking it was Sage that lived in Oklahoma City.
Yeah, Sage was my flight engineer, and we went to see him in Oklahoma. Isn't it Tulsa where they live?
No, Oklahoma City.
Did you have something painted on the side of your ship?
No.
Like
Tell them the name
Name
of
of it was Ruff, R-U-F-F.
Tell them why.
Well, the common saying was when somebody, the other crews would come back, how was the mission? It was rough. No, they come back with 50 holes blown in the plane, or 100 machine gun holes, or somebody killed, or something. So that was what we named our plane. We named it Rough. And we had I had bought a little dog at an auction, a little pet dog, named him Rough. And when we did flying, it was just in England, you'd have sometimes if they had rebuilt engines or oxygen system or something, you just take it up for a test flight. So I'd take that dog along. And we put a throat mic on the dog.
What?
Throat microphone.
Oh.
And he barked. And I could put that on the air, you know, and so
And send it back to
the whole crew could hear it, or other planes. And usually you weren't in formation if you were doing something like that, usually by yourself. But let him bark. Rough.
Did you got leave when you were sometimes in London?
Yeah, we go to London.
When the Germans bombed?
Yeah, we'd go out on the street and watch the anti-aircraft fire in London. Any one city in Germany got many more times damage than all of England put together in the whole war. Like Berlin would have been like 20 Englands.
Wow.
The damage. And in London, you didn't see, you could see some bomb damage, but it was a rare thing.
So how did Germany hold up under all that?
I don't know.
They're sturdy people.
Was it just spread so thin that they couldn't launch that heavy an attack on England?
Well, they didn't have the bomber forces.
Didn't have them.
No.
So they do it more as a psychological thing, huh?
Probably, yeah. Yeah.
Tell them about the story about radar. The Germans had radar, right, before the Allies.
I don't know.
Was there something? What was it? Yeah, you were telling me about it. They used to use foil to
Yeah, we used what they call chaff, which was just aluminum, pieces of a little aluminum foil, and the waste gunners would throw that out. That was for the anti-aircraft batteries. They could get your height by, I don't know what the device was. So it interfered with their anti-aircraft batteries and getting your right altitude. So that's why they threw that stuff out.
Well, thank you all for coming to
this is great.
remember 60 years ago.
God, I hate to quit. There's got to be at least this much more to tell.
Well,
A lot more.
not only that, but we need to have a session where you tell the stories of growing up in Pueblo. That was almost a war zone.
Yeah,
Don't get
like the
started
one
on
about
that.
I forget, the painting the canvas to look like the end of a train or something.
Oh, yeah, I worked for a guy that did that.
And the railroad tracks, putting the soap in the tracks and putting the fire on them.
Streetcar tracks, yeah.
Streetcar tracks.
What's the story at Palomar when they were building on and doing dynamite? You heard it going off back behind the building there when you were teaching.
I don't remember, Mike.
Huh. What I remember is you couldn't, you about hit the floor thinking it was a bomb going off. And
Yeah, I remember you telling me about that. They had blasted for something, hadn't they?
Yeah.
And you were still skitterish enough
Yeah.
that you,
I just didn't remember that.
huh.
I don't remember the details, but I remember something about you couldn't tolerate being in with it going on outside there and you not seeing it.
There was a plane that we were in briefing, and it was we were just going to the coast of France, which was we called a milk run because you're only over enemy territory for maybe 10 or 15 minutes. And it was fun because you got counted as a full mission, and you only be in the air for maybe 2 hours. Anyway, we were in briefing and explosion, and I swear the roof of that building lifted up. You could see daylight. Now that might not have happened, but it seems to me it was something like that. And most of the guys hit the floor and tried to crawl under the benches, and I just sat there. I wasn't brave. I guess I was dumb, but anyway. A plane, there were full load of bombs and a gas load, and it blew up. And they don't know why. And it was maybe a half a mile away, and blew bodies all over, and they had to go out and pick up pieces of bodies. Dogs were running around getting pieces of bodies.
Well, I hope the lesson that Ben and Joe, I think Joe's out of it by now, but have learned tonight is how awful, horrible,
Kill people.
futile war is. It's such a dumb thing that people do to each other.
Did your plane blow up or something? And when you were called back, you were going to be sent out, and then they called your team back, and somebody else took their plane?
Well, somebody else flew our plane, yeah. The day we weren't flying. And it blew up after takeoff. And then my waist gunner said, well, that siphoned gas every time we took off. I said, well, why didn't you say so? So whether that was why or not, I don't know. Could have been.
You did what?
Well, they fill the tanks clear full, and if they don't get the lid on there, the vacuum on the top of the wing sucks gas out of the top of the fuel tank. We came back from one mission by ourselves because we had one engine shot out, and we couldn't stay up to speed in formation. We've been to Nuremberg, and so we flew back by ourselves at a slower speed, and different formations would pass us. And on that one, this bombardier would sit up there, and usually they had a battery of 6 guns. So you'd start seeing the battery of black puffs of the anti-aircraft fire. There'd be 6 of them. So he's counting them there, and he counts up to 5, and he wondered where the 6th one is. It went off right under him and blew a big hole through his butt.
Oh.
He knew where the 6th one was. And so Sage got down there and got the first aid kit and doped him up with morphine and bandaged him up, and he was between the pilot and co-pilot, back is where there was a door, so you could see down. They were down in that hallway. Well, there'd be formations of B-24s would pass us, because we couldn't stay up in formation. We couldn't fly fast enough. So Guyard, the bombardier, would look out there and say, well, those are B-24s. I said, yeah, that's what we're flying today. We are? Yeah, we always fly 24s. And then pretty soon they'd be gone, and then maybe a B-17 group would come up. Well, those are B-17s. Well, of course, we always fly B-17s. So we'd razz him about that. Well, on that flight, when we got back, you could shoot a red flare, which you got priority to land, and there'd be an ambulance to meet you. So we shot some red flares and came in, and we didn't have a brake. The brake system was out. The hydraulic system was out. But you had a hand pump. You could pump it. So Sage he turned it off once we knew it was leaking. So after we landed, he could pump the hydraulic pressure up so we could brake, and we just went off the side of the runway into the field. And got out of the plane, and the gasoline was running down over the supercharger, which is turned by the exhaust, and just you could hear it sissing.
Oh.
Gasoline was sissing from the heat
Oh,
That
God.
had to have been going on
while we were flying.
Oh, geez.
Oh,
And why it didn't blow up right there.
oh, we are all so lucky that this
Oh.
Had
here.
to get the ambulance, had to get Sage out of the nose, and we got out.
Mm.
The movie, what's the name of that?
Memphis Belle.
Has everybody seen that?
I
I've
have.
seen that.
Isn't that the one where he draws a picture of the tire? Yeah. Because they have a flat tire, they can't land.
Well, the movie started out, we didn't show it tonight, where the B-17 comes in on one wheel down, one wheel up.
Yeah.
Lands and slides to a stop, and then it blows up.
And it blows up, yeah.
But most of the time, they bellied them in and survived. They land on a grassy field. Well, I wasn't trying to take you through the whole war, but
Oh, I think
Wow,
that's
this is great.
not enough yet.
You
You're
saw
a-
all sorts of bombs that didn't go off when they were dropped in Europe.
Yeah.
yeah.
So friends of mine at university worked summer jobs where they would have this magnetometer. It finds big metallic objects. There'd be some big construction project, and they would find to dig out this field, so they hire this other company that my friends work for. They'd go across with a magnetometer and find bombs once in a while.
Wow.
Some big concrete.
Making you sound like a warmonger.
Well, they've been sitting there for
War.
So the more we hear, the less we'll want of really a war
Go off.
now.
Well, unless
Yeah.
you started
Maybe, yeah.
like digging up with a bagger or something, so you had to find them and call the bomb squad.
They probably could take and screw the fuses out. Might be able to defuse them. They
Well, my friends didn't have that job. They just said something on the market, spot in the maps right now. You gotta look here.
Yeah.
the Pearl Harbor, was supposedly caught us by surprise, December 7th. Well, in England, I used to take the Jeep and go down to where our plane was and get the bomb crates, wooden crates that the bombs came in, and we'd break them up and burn them in the stove to keep warm. And one time I was down there and I looked, and there was a date. The bomb crates had dates on them when the things were packaged. These were September of '41, 3 months before Pearl Harbor, and we're dropping these by the tens of thousands. But we were unprepared for war. So crazy.
Why
It's
can't
insanity.
man learn from what has happened in history?
I don't know.
It just is
Well, I
incredible.
think man does.
You gotta go.
I just think that it's the idiots that are, the politicians that are in power that don't care.
Yeah,
You know, the priorities.
yeah, that's right.
Man itself, I think, does learn and tries to.
I guess
Because
you're right.
Just a select
Mhm.
few.
Well, that's one of the problems. Man learns, and the problem is that some of them learn that war, you make a lot of money when you have a war.
Yeah.
So that's what they learn,
That's what they learn, yeah.
and they learned that by going to war, we kept the strongest economy in the world, and they learned that. So they've learned all these things that lead them in this direction that just propagates the next disaster. So it's like, I mean, it's not like they're completely stupid people. They're pretty smart people.
No,
They've
they're
just been
screwed.
fed all the wrong information and have processed it wrong without looking at the rest of it. They've ignored this huge part of the world and only paid attention. I mean, those people, they're not like evil people out to do bad in the world. They've ignored the parts that they should have paid attention to and been fed all this other stuff. It's like, if they can, you talk to someone who's a big proponent of war and they'll explain it in a way that, unless you know better, it makes sense.
It does.
Well, I think calling civilian collateral damage is
Yep.
evil.
Collateral damage.
Yeah.
That's the word, that term.
Let me make one more comment about the bread.
Yeah,
Okay.
the economics.
For the 8 months I was at Saigon, the food was all turned over to two of our fellows that were cooks, and all we got was the cigarettes out of the Red Cross portion. And it was communal food. There wasn't any stealing until it became private.
Mm. Hmm.
In other words, the statement, F you, this is our bread, or this is my bread. See, as long as it was a communal, it was our bread.
Mm-hmm.
That was my bread. And there was stealing of food at Nuremberg went on that we knew about. Not very much.
A long way to go.
Well, Vern, you only put one to sleep.
Well, I dozed off when I was over there. That's why I moved from over there.
Well, Gramps, thanks for sharing the story.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thanks.
Oh, thank all of you for sharing with us.
Think back on some of that stuff.
I am so glad that he got back. Just think, I would never have known you.
I've never known anybody.
It wouldn't exist. Your dad wouldn't have existed.
I wouldn't have known Eric, and I wouldn't have known Joe, and I wouldn't have known Ben.
I wouldn't have been the youngest always.
I'd be running around up here all by myself. Yeah.
No fun.
Get in trouble around. Joe, we're gonna have a test on that. Will you be able to answer the question?
Over. Did you see that
No.
dance there? Hey, Carrie and I.
I've often
Oh.
wondered how
That's okay.
Chewing it, and you chew for about, I don't know, 5 seconds or so. And all of a sudden you're like, what the hell's wrong with this stuff? Spit it out. What it had been, cheese had been in a warehouse that had ammonia for the refrigerant. It had been bombed. So the cheese had absorbed ammonia,
That's disgusting.
but you couldn't smell it.
Ugh.
The cheese looked great. We didn't smell any ammonia. But you take the film off your teeth and start chewing, and pretty soon the film is all gone out of your teeth. They're dry. They got dry teeth rubbing up and down.
Oh, that's horrible.
So what we did then was, Glenn and I would come out and yell out to the guys out playing soccer or playing softball, hey, we got some good Swiss cheese here, big crates of cheese, come and get some. And they'd come in there and we'd give them a big slice of cheese, watch them, oh boy, they start chewing that, you know, and cheese, spit it out, what the hell's in the cheese? It was a horrible feeling to have your teeth just go dry.
Well, I think you were as mean to your
Well,
fellow
yeah.
prisoners as
Well, they need entertainment, right?
Exactly.
See, now they can sit there with their grandchildren now and tell them these stories about how their friends would give them the cheese, and then you know everyone that came in and took the cheese was happy to sit around the next time around and watch the next sucker come in and eat the cheese.
They go get somebody else.
Yeah.
Go out with a big chunk, and they go in there, you get some cheese in there. You watch them, you get in there and watch them take a bite. Glenn got a crap game going once for packs of cigarettes. And he got hot with the dice, and I was fading with him. I wasn't against him. You know, was he put down 5 packs of cigarettes, people would cover that, and I'd put down 2 or 3 packs of cigarettes. They'd cover it, and he'd roll the dice, and he'd win. We cleaned that barracks out. We had a huge box of packs of cigarettes. And that, nobody would play, shoot craps anymore. They wouldn't gamble with cigarettes. That was the only one afternoon.
Isn't that sad that
Crap game.
cigarettes was so important?
Because they were so desperate.
Bored.
You know, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
There was Russians cigarettes or Belgium, I don't know what. They got once in a while. They didn't come in a Red Cross or a parcel of any kind. They just had a ration of cigarettes. And those things must have been dried horse manure or something. You couldn't smoke.
Well, that was probably better for you than tobacco.
They were just, even the German guards wouldn't take them. They smoked those. They were horrible. Another thing we used to do, whenever one of the German guards would, and the ones that we called goons, they just roamed around and watched stuff. They didn't have guns or anything. They just inspected. They'd look under the barracks and come through the rooms and watch you on the field. And if you saw one of them carrying anything, they had boxes or something that they're carrying, you stop and ask them for a light for your cigarette. Even if you didn't, you had matches yourself.
You just wanted to see him.
Just stop.
Struggle
They
with-
stop,
with
put them down, they give you a light, pick it up and go on.
The next guy would ask
They
you.
did.
Mike, that there was a German prison camp just outside of Greeley. And Filaby worked out there.
Oh.
I thought that was a Japanese or a Korean
German.
or something.
It was German.
German. And they worked on farms, they farmed them out. But that was their main camp.
And every now and then I'd go out, not onto the camp itself, but I'd go out, I don't know, if Filaby had to go do something and I'd go with him. And it was interesting because I didn't have any animosity towards those German prisoners. And here was actual man. Yeah.
It's funny, isn't it, to bring them clear over here and ship them all the way to Greeley.
Yeah, I was thinking of that this morning. They must have come by train, I would assume. And then,
Partway anyway.
Probably on a
and
ship.
then by, well, and then by bus from the train depot out. It was, I don't know how far
What, out to the camp?
that prison camp was.
It was almost halfway,
I was
about
going to say halfway. to
maybe
Loveland.
9 miles west of Greeley. Close to halfway. Between their Loveland Road.
How big was it?
I don't know.
I don't know
I
that.
don't-
I don't know that I ever heard Bonnie say.
But I know a lot of them worked on farms, farm laborers. farmers would pick them up there and take them out to the farm and work them for a day and then bring them back at night.
Hmm. Well, that beat the heck out of sitting around all day.
Sure.
Mhm. Definitely.
Yeah, in another 2 hours, it'll be 62 years.
Just like that.
Really not down,
62.
That'll be 63.
It had to be 61 years, because you added another year on the end of 60.
I know what you would like to have been liberated before you got shot down.
Yeah.
Instead of having that year in between where you just get really crowded.
That'll be the way to do it.
Well, if they liberated you a year earlier, you'd have never been shot down.
No. That was too late. I ran into a fellow here in town that was at Safeway one time. And he saw my POW license plates. And he had been with Patton's outfit,
That liberated you.
liberated us.
Hmm.
And then a week or so later, he was captured as a POW. We're fighting further on. And he was a POW for like 2 weeks.
Oh, really?
And so he wasn't eligible for the free license plates.
Oh, for heaven's
Because he wasn't a prisoner long enough?
Had to be, I don't know what the time factor was.
Well, that's
He
kind
was
of
a prisoner
ridiculous.
after I was liberated, and then he was liberated. Just 10 days.
So he didn't count as a prisoner.
No.
That's crazy.
Isn't that crazy?
And I got free license plate, free Blue Cross plate from a truck. Saves a few dollars on the car. The truck one doesn't save much. Car does.
That was
Well,
nice
you-
of him to call.
You know that that's what the decision was based on, is what would it cost to give him a free license
That way
plate.
she could get in on
Sure.
it, you know, at some level.
Yeah.
It shouldn't have been. It's been 2 days. He was a prisoner of war.
Yeah. For 2 hours.
Yeah.
Are you going over there then, take a picture?
No, you know what she's doing? She wants to do something big because she's turned 30.
This guy
They're going
climbed right on the chimney.
Cortez, down by Baja, and then they go kayaking.
in Mexico. For heaven's sake.
Now you kayak on a sea. Just paddle around.
Paddle. We were there, you know, I guess you were in on that stuff. You would go with them and Tobias and lots of dolphins, those right swoops.
Oh,
Kayak.
Oh.
Nice.
Well, good.
Yeah.
So she's gonna be 30.
Well, you got one too?
Mm-hmm.
Gopher's got it also recorded. Okay. We can get a copy from one of them. We can do that one too if you want.
Would you suppose I put it over here, Eric? To hear it, no?
Maybe.
Okay, go.
All right, 60 years ago today, I was shot down on third mission to Berlin, and I was asked to give some comments about things that happened during that year, and 59 years ago today, I was liberated, not 61 years ago that Grandma thought.
Gopher, you have to understand, I knew that it was 60 years ago because Pat had just been born when he was shot down. And a year later, he was liberated, so that should have been 61 years.
Well,
I got one.
So
I would say not.
this is to get you in the flavor of things that I might talk about.
You can sit on this one.
Balanced all, brought all to mind. The years to come seemed a waste of breath. A waste of breath the years behind. In balance with this life, this death.
You're going up! Start engine in 5 minutes! 5 minutes!
Hey, Lieutenant, I was thinking if you really want to, you can come back and find my gun. I'm not giving you my dog. Oh, Lieutenant, I don't want that flea-bitten mangy old boots anyway. Hey!